So unlike Kevin, I'm going to take a little bit of a broader approach. I'm going to look at world myth in general because, of course, Tolkien was familiar with, a lot of different world myth cycles, and they were very important to his work. So you started with the specific, so now you're going to get the general. So we're going to move back a little bit in that sense.
Excuse me, just a minute. What do you prefer, this or this?
These ones are lighter. I think it's better. I don't know.
You? Or you prefer that? No,
yeah,
this?
This one, yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, Tolkien first penned the cosmogonical myth, The Music of the Ainur, sometime between 1918 and 1920, making it one of his oldest writings related to Middle-earth. But what sets The Music of the Ainur apart as a notable early work is how little it changed compared with the other contemporaneous writings that established his secondary world of Middle-earth. Tolkien's earliest stories teemed with details verging on the fanciful, where gods of death still dwelt in halls roofed with bat wings, and a prince of cats still held all lesser cats in thrall. In 1926, Tolkien cut these tales down to the bare bones in his sketch of the mythology, excising much of this florid detail in favor of rebuilding the stories in a much more somber style, with the emphasis falling on the doomed and desperate northern courage exerted by the early heroes among both elves and men. It is this world that would give rise first to The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and of course, the posthumously published Silmarillion. Yet as Christopher Tolkien notes in his commentary on The Music of the Ainur, alone of Tolkien's stories, the creation story remained mostly unchanged. The key concepts, main storyline, and style remain constant, thus showing that the cosmogony of Arda was in place from his earliest to his latest versions of the myths of Middle-earth. This constancy establishes it as an important text in understanding the myths and tales of Middle-earth that Tolkien produced across his lifetime. Analyzing the evolution of The Music of the Ainur, Trevor Hart notes that the primary change Tolkien introduced was more firmly delineating the differences in the roles between Eru and the Ainur, between creation and subcreation. When considering the Ainulindale as a creation myth, this becomes of a special significance. Nearly all world myth cycles contain a cosmogonical myths, and Tolkien's is no exception. In his 1947 essay on fairy stories, Tolkien acknowledges that the exploration of similarities and possible connections between the myths and stories of our real world as a perfectly legitimate procedure in itself, while simultaneously cautioning those undertaking a search for broad patterns in the forest not to lose sight of the individual trees, the stories themselves in their most essential role as stories. In an era where scholarship sought similarities between myths, Tolkien asserted that the differences could be just as intriguing, writing in on fairy stories, that it is precisely the coloring, the atmosphere, the unclassifiable individual details of a story, and above all, the general purport that informs with life the undissected bones of the plot that really count. This particular approach to studying Tolkien's cosmogony proves fruitful. Much scholarly work has been done on the cosmogonies of world mythology, yet examining the Ainulindale within this context shows that it fits poorly with its cosmogonical brethren, inviting the reader to consider instead those unclassifiable individual details that distinguish the Ainulindale from other creation stories. On Fairy Stories provides the reason for this difference by establishing the theory of subcreation as the most essential underpinning of the Ainulindale, a theory that justifies and elevates Tolkien's own creative work. In a sense, myths are self-fulfilling prophecies, writes Barbara C. Sproul in Primal Myths, Creating the World. They create facts out of the values they propound. Through a culture's creation story, we can discover not only that culture's core values, but its most basic existential understandings, which are then impressed upon other myths and stories, an idea that manifests in Tolkien's Middle-earth stories, which unfold themes first expressed in the Ainulindale. In style, the Ainulindale reads every bit as a creation story, but in terms of motifs shared with other world creation myths, the incongruities overwhelm the similarities. In his 1963 book, Alpha, The Myths of Creation, religion scholar Charles H. Long proposed 5 categories into which creation myths can be classified: creation from nothing, creation from chaos, world parent myths, emergence myths, and earth diver myths. The first 3 types appear in myths with which we know Tolkien to have been familiar: the mythologies of Western Europe, those of the Abrahamic tradition, and the ancient literature of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Therefore, Tolkien did not lack cosmogonical models when developing the creation myth for his secondary world, yet the Ainulindale fits uneasily into Long's taxonomy, touching only lightly upon the most common cosmogonical archetypes, including those elements used in the creation story with which Tolkien was familiar. Critics have certainly sought connections between the Ainulindale and specific creation myths. John Goh sought correspondence between the Ainulindale and the creation myth of the North Cycle, beloved to Tolkien, and came to the unmitigated conclusion that, quote, The Norse creation myth and Tolkien's clearly share no common ground. Other critics have identified the Hebraic Genesis as a source, with one critic concluding that the Ainulindale is derivative, having biblical origins and Eddaic roots. Certainly there are motifs shared between the Bible and the Ainulindale, as Kevin showed, but again, the differences overwhelm the similarities. The use of subcreators in the Ainulindale, the differing times and modes of entry of evil into the world, and the relative remove of Tolkien's Eru from the world compared to the biblical God. The remaining and overwhelming majority of the Ainulindale lacks precedent among world creation mythology. The Ainulindale begins with creation from nothing. There was Eru, the One, who in Arda is called Iluvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the Holy Ones. They were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And that's it. After that single opening sentence, emphasis shifts from Eru's creative role to the subcreative roles of the Ainur, until Eru is required to engender that imagined world with actual existence with his utterance of Ea, let these things be. Let's look first at the similarities between the Ainulindale and other creation from nothing myths. Eru creates the Ainur from a thought and then makes their envisioned universe manifest with a word. In his encyclopedia, Creation Myths of the World, David Adams Leeming classifies creation stories not just using Long's 5-part taxonomy, but also on the basis of frequent motifs that arise in cosmogonical stories. Both creation from thought and creation from words are common subtypes within the creation from nothing taxon. Leeming writes, of all the explanations of the beginning of creation, the concept of creation by thought perhaps makes the most sense to human beings, because we all initiate creative acts primarily by thought. Likewise, he notes the human ability to use language makes word-based creation a common subtype among world creation myths. These similarities tether the Ainulindale to the genre of creation stories in several important ways. First, it is important to recall that Tolkien insisted on the originality of his invented mythology and responded with exasperation to readers who treated his stories as pastiches of world myths and sought to find the source of his work. These tales are new, he wrote in 1951 to Milton Waldman. They are not directly derived from other myths and legends, but they must inevitably contain a large measure of ancient widespread motives or elements. In 1972, echoing on fairy stories, he wrote to a Mr. Wrigley that, to my mind, it is the particular use of a particular situation of any motive, whether invented, deliberately borrowed, or unconsciously remembered, that is the most important thing to consider. So again, taking Tolkien's advice to heart as far as how to proceed, why did he choose to form these particular connections between creation stories of the creation from nothing type and his Ainulindale? I believe there are two important reasons. Firstly, the elements he chose to include in the Ainulindale are common throughout world myth, as attested by Leeming's study. The vast majority of readers will likely recognize most of them, making the Ainulindale feel real as a creation myth, and upon this realistic backdrop, allowing Tolkien's more original elements to stand out in stark relief. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, these similarities accord not only with the creation from nothing type generally, but specifically with the biblical creation story, cleverly allowing Tolkien to employ a paganistic pantheon similar to those of his beloved Germanic and Finnish myth cycles without contradicting his own Catholic beliefs about the origins of the universe. Especially creation from word or logos, present in both the Ainulindale and in the Gospel of John, allows Eru enough correspondence with the Christian God to allow Tolkien to excuse his mythology as a, quote, tribute to the infinity of his potential variety, as he did in a letter to Peter Hastings. Tolkien states as much to Milton Waldman, allowing his appointing the Ainur as lesser powers beneath a single god can yet be accepted, well, shall we say baldly, by a mind that believes in the Blessed Trinity. Yet the bulk of the Ainulindale has no grounding in existing creation myths, with two major differences fairly unique. First is the relative attention paid to the act of subcreation by the Ainur versus actual creation by Eru. Second is the use of music, not thought or spoken word, not a tangible handicraft, as the means by which that subcreation is effected. In On Fairy Stories, Tolkien presents the metaphor of a cauldron containing the sum total of story elements used throughout the world, asserting that the cooks do not dip in the ladle quite blindly. Just as Tolkien selected enough details to make the Ainulindale feel real, he also dipped the ladle to present elements that stand apart from the rest of world creation stories. On Fairy Stories was first presented at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland in 1939 and was revised and published in a memorial volume for Charles Williams in 1947. The essay introduces Tolkien's theories on the fantasy genre. Perhaps the most important concept introduced in On Fairy Stories is that of subcreation, the use of art to make a secondary world with enough inner consistency of reality that a reader or listener can imaginatively enter into that world. For Tolkien, subcreation had a religious dimension as well. As a devout Catholic and believing humankind to be created in the image of God, he saw the human drive to subcreate as originating from the divine model. In the poem Mythopoeia, quoted in On Fairy Stories, Tolkien concludes succinctly, "We make still by the law in which we're made." Tolkien acknowledges at several points in his letters that the formation of Arda by the Ainur is an act of subcreation. Certainly, the creation of the universe, earth, or humankind as an artistic process is not wholly alien to world creation myths. Leeming identifies the creator as artist, as a subtype within the creation from chaos taxon. The artist, presented with the raw and chaotic stuff of the universe as artistic materials, arranges the primeval substance so as to establish order and meaning. Leeming writes, "To keep chaos ordered, we need to constantly experience it in new ways. The artist and we become analogous to the creator god or gods who choose to make order out of the primeval chaos." Leeming, in essence, describes the concept of subcreation. None of the myth cycles with which Tolkien was known to have been familiar utilize the creator as artist motif. This aspect appears most often in Native American mythologies. Furthermore, the Ainulindale deviates sharply from this motif in terms of the type of art employed. Leeming describes the creator as artist subtype as representing the world made through human craft, such as pottery, tent building, or sculpture. Yet although some of them assume that role eventually, the Ainur are not initially craftsmen, they are singers. And world creation myths involving creation from song are rare, and again largely confined to the Americas. Tolkien's use of this unfamiliar element in the Ainulindale, however, is significant. According to Leeming, the fact that the creator is a tent builder, or potter, or sculptor makes him one of us, and that in turn makes what we do sacred and significant. The Deus Faber creation is a celebration of human ingenuity and a justification for what we do. And it turns out that what we do into something mystical and magical. It makes our crafts microcosmic representations of creation itself. As a philologist and a storyteller, Tolkien sought to justify those arts in which language had the power to bridge the imagined and the real. Eru's first act is to create singers, who actualize Eru's abstract thought into a vision that begins as a secondary world, before being endowed by Eru with the flame imperishable and becoming a primary world. Here are the contrasts between relatively little time spent discussing creation by Eru, as compared to subcreation by the Ainur, becomes important. In On Fairy Stories, Tolkien writes, "To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft." Eru's creation of the world is instantaneous and effortless, commanding only a few sentences of the Ainulindale. The act of subcreation by the Ainur, in contrast, is one requiring that labor and thought and special skill that Tolkien identified. Understandably, the subcreative efforts of the Ainur receive the bulk of attention in the story. The work of a wordsmith, whether a poet, songwriter, or storyteller, can be tedious work, and work that certainly requires a special skill. Tolkien's letters reveal his hopeful assertions of having The Lord of the Rings completed by the late 1940s, but that promise was followed by a decade of setbacks, illnesses, family crises, professional obligations, uprooting, and of course, the Second World War. Throughout this tumultuous time, as Tolkien became increasingly mindful that what began as a mere sequel to The Hobbit was burgeoning beyond anything he ever anticipated in terms of time, labor, or page count, one cannot help but to remember the dismay felt by the Ainur as they first arrived in the world Eru made for them. But when the Valar entered into Ea, they were at first astounded and at a loss, for it was as if naught was yet made, which they had seen in vision, and all was but on point to begin, and yet unshaped, and it was dark. The Ainulindale, therefore, invests song, poetry, and story with a special, even sacred significance. It presents the secondary world as originating through a process that parallels the genesis of many of Tolkien's own written works, especially his most important, such as the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. It also parallels the creative achievements of the cultures that preoccupied Tolkien both professionally and imaginatively: the Anglo-Saxons, the Norse, the Finnish, and the Celts, societies whose literary achievements are but rare extant manifestations of a rich oral storytelling tradition long lost to mortal ears. In many of these societies, eulogy conferred legitimacy to a ruler, a dynasty, or a remembered event. Then people of all professions and classes utilized poetry as a means to memorialize witnessed events. For this reason, Anglo-Saxon kings named their heirs so as to alliterate with the names of their ancestors, which made it easier to preserve that name in song. In other words, the very fabrics of these cultures were shaped by the spoken word in a way that is difficult for us to imagine, steeped as we are in a text-dominated culture. The cultures of Middle-earth display similar predilections. The elves, Tolkien wrote, quote, did not depend on perishable records, being stored in the vast houses of their minds, end quote, and Middle-earth's people have an oral tradition discernible from the songs and poems published in Tolkien's writings, especially The Lord of the Rings. This oral tradition carries with it remnants of the power of the original creation, accomplished in the same manner of song. It seems no coincidence that the Ainur sing the creation of the world much in the manner of the shops of old, and only see the barest threads of this vast story put into writing, much as the surviving Germanic, Finnish, and Celtic tales give the sense of having grasped at a vast sea of myth and story, and come up with only a palm's worth to store apart from the eroding forces of time. In his reference to the Valar as sub-creators, writes Debbie Slide, Tolkien is possibly making a fairly grandiose claim for his genre. Indeed, in light of Tolkien's theory of subcreation and the Ainulindale, one cannot help but to think of Tolkien alongside his Ainur as authors of a universe. Indeed, my chief contention with Sly's observation is her use of the word grandiose. Tolkien's understanding of his subcreative role as on par with that of the Ainur is not grandiose. It is what he did, with the allowance that he neither possessed the supernatural skills nor the eternal lifespan of his Ainur. Within his capabilities as a mere mortal, Tolkien authored a universe. Myth cycles begin with a creation story, and Tolkien's is no exception. His cosmogonical myth was one of the first he wrote and remained the pole star amid a collection of myths that underwent drastic changes as they evolved, as myths will do, as the maturation of the author stood in for the slow evolution of a culture across eras. Just like the Ainur, Tolkien eventually found that world he had labored to bring into being and worked upon with great pleasure, had taken on its own impetus, and lived at least somewhat beyond his control. If cosmogonical myths impress their core ideas upon all the myths that follow, then Tolkien's creation story did just that, as subcreation became a central theme in his created world and in his own life. For Middle-earth, its cultures and its histories have long achieved the inertia of a real mythology that lives independently of the voice that first made it real. Just as the greatest myth cycles inspire further subcreation in the form of transformative interpretations and retellings, the fans and successors of Tolkien's work have invested it with the life of a true mythic tradition, sometimes letting an overlooked element of the myth shine forth, as in Tolkien's theory of recovery from one fairy stories, and sometimes corrupting and diminishing. Tolkien certainly seems to have felt ambivalence toward this possibility, writing in 1972 that being a cult figure in one's own lifetime, I am afraid, is not at all pleasant, even as he expresses the wish to, quote, leave scope for other minds and hands wielding paint and music and drama. To return to the grandiose claim of the Ainur representing Tolkien's own role, Tolkien felt an absence of myth in the modern world, and his song, like that of the Ainur, provisioned that void with the stories that would become a mythology for the 20th and 21st centuries. The end.